Hi there, this is John Gamble. I'm Director of Marketing at Corelight. Welcome to today's broadcast and thanks for tuning in. Today we'll be talking about how Zeek can help you detect the TTPs, that's techniques, tactics, and procedures of MITRE ATT&CK. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. So GoToWebinar, if you're not familiar, has a questions panel, so you can actually ask questions at any point during this webcast. We'll probably be saving questions until the end for our panelists today, James and Richard. But if you do have a question at any point during the webcast, you can pop over to that questions tab on your GoToWebinar panel and chat it right there, and we will see that question and try to get it answered for you at the end. Also, today's webcast is being recorded, so a copy of this webcast will be made available. We will be putting it up on our YouTube channel, and if you'd like a copy personally, you can also reach out to us via email. That's webinars@corelight.com. And get a copy yourself if you'd like. So with that, let's get started. I'm going to walk us through kind of an agenda today and introduce you to today's great, awesome guest panelists. These two guys have a ton of experience in this field, and I think we're really lucky to be able to hear from them today. Next slide. So this presentation is a couple different steps here. We'll have a walkthrough of MITRE ATT&CK, which we don't want to presume deep familiarity with this framework that MITRE has put together. So we'll be going through that in some detail and giving you a history of where it came from, how it's being used today, and why it's growing in popularity across the security industry. The meat of this presentation, we're really going to dive into how Zeek, which is an open source network security monitor, how Zeek as a security tool can really help you look at some of the attack TTPs and start to monitor and detect some of them using techniques and scripts and logs that the Zeek tool generates. Briefly, I'll talk a little bit about how Corelight fits into the picture. We are a commercialization of open source Zeek in our product line, so we make Zeek sensors and we make it easy to deploy. And lastly, we'll close on a Q&A. And again, if you're just joining us now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this call, if you have a question, use your chat panel on the right, the questions tab, type it in. We'll see it and we'll try to get to it at the end. Next slide. Today's guest speakers. So we've got two really, really experienced people on the line. So I would encourage you to take advantage of that and ask questions throughout the presentation. Between Richard and James, there's just a wealth of security knowledge. Richard Bejtlich is Principal Security Strategist here at Corelight. Before that, he served as Chief Security Strategist at FireEye and Manient's Chief Security Officer when FireEye was acquired in 2013. He also led security teams at General Electric and started his career in the Air Force Computer Emergency Response Team. Richard's also a prolific author. He's got a number of books out there, including his fourth book, The Practice of Network Security Monitoring, and you can also follow him on his blog and Twitter as well. We're also joined today by James, a Federal Solutions Engineer here at Corelight. James previously spent time at A10 Networks and more than a decade at the MITRE Corporation. So James, I think, is well familiar with the MITRE organization. And if you have questions related to the attack framework, both Richard and James are great resources here. During his time at MITRE, James served in various leadership roles, Security Operations Center Engineering to improve communication capabilities for partner nations, including another of other roles. And he's a graduate of Virginia Tech and George Washington University. Next slide. So now I think Richard's going to walk us through kind of the history, origin, and how to think about using the MITRE ATT&CK framework.
Great. Thank you, John, and thank you, James, for joining me today. And thank you to you all for dialing in to this webinar. MITRE ATT&CK, as was mentioned in the SANS Cyber Threat Intelligence Summit yesterday, is so hot right now. And it was said with a British accent, which made it even funnier. And this was said by people from ATT&CK who were presenting on it. So you've probably heard of it, but I wanted to give a little bit of an intro in case you haven't, and also to talk about how it fits in with what we're going to be discussing today. The best place to just start is to go to the ATT&CK website, which is attack.mitre.org. And the way that I hear the ATT&CK team describing ATT&CK, and also the way I think about it, is it's a language to describe adversary activity. It's a language in the sense that it defines what certain activity means. And there's a knowledge base behind that language. So when someone talks about lateral movement, I can have in my mind a picture of what lateral movement means. Someone else may have a different idea of what lateral movement means. But if we want to find out if we both mean the same thing, we can go to the MITRE ATT&CK knowledge base and look and see what they define as lateral movement. The way that attack differentiates between different types of activity is to use the language of tactics, techniques, and procedures. And this is terminology that's derived from the military, and it's TTPs exist at the lowest level of conflict, underneath operations or campaigns, underneath strategy, underneath national policy. The way the MITRE ATT&CK team broke down this different sort of adversary activity is to think of different steps that an intruder might take, call those tactics, to define specific ways to accomplish those tactics, call those techniques, and then the carrying out of those techniques is called a procedure. And typically when people reference this information, they use the T number that's assigned to the technique, and we'll see an example of that shortly. Now, this is the theory of attack, but the way that it's mostly manifested at this point is in adversary theft of information from an enterprise environment. So the way that the genesis of attack was MITRE taking a look at activity that they had observed, and also that could be derived from publicly reported intrusion reports. And these intrusion reports were more focused around what could be considered advanced persistent threat activity. So you're talking about nation state actors or nation state sponsored actors who are pursuing espionage for intellectual property. This is a very specific type of activity. And while it's very important, it does not encompass all of the different sorts of things that one might worry about when you're defending your information. And if you were to narrow it down even further, if you take a look at what has gotten the most attention in attack and the uses of it, it's almost, or it's very specifically around Windows systems with endpoint detection response agents. So for example, MITRE recently did or completed and published their evaluations of several EDR agents and showed how they would or would not fulfill certain elements of attack. So our goal with this webinar is to provide you a look at some of the elements of attack that have a network flavor, and then to talk about how Zeek could help you fulfill that. And could I have the next slide, please, James? So just to give you a little bit more color on around attack, here is an excerpt of the attack navigator. This is a website you can visit. I've got the URL at the bottom. And across the top, that first row, those are the tactics that are being pursued. Initial access, execution, persistence, and so forth. So these are the general categories of activities that an intruder would follow, execute in order to gain access to an enterprise environment for the purposes of stealing information. The blocks that follow, those rows represent techniques. So those are specific ways to accomplish initial access or execution or persistence or whatever. And this particular slide, I had to cut off because I wanted it to be legible to the majority of the audience. But these columns proceed down many depths. So you could, if I were to try to render this, to capture all of it and put it on a slide, you wouldn't be able to read any of it. This is one of the issues that people are finding with attack, and even the attack team itself recognizes this. And there's been some discussion perhaps that there needs to be a refactoring of this, because we just keep adding as a community, and the MITRE team keeps adding to attack in the pursuit of trying to better describe adversary activity. But as a result, it's becoming perhaps a little bit unwieldy. Could I have the next slide, please, James? So this is, if you were to click on one of those columns and select one of the rows there, this is the type of information you would get. And this is really, I think, what some of the coolest stuff in attack is to be found. This is an example of a technique. So you remember at the top, you've got those tactics. The tactic that this technique was chosen from was lateral movement. And the technique example here is remote desktop protocol. So this, in other words, talks about how an intruder might use remote desktop protocol in order to perform lateral movement. So you can imagine a Windows environment, multiple systems, an intruder has access to one of them. he or she realizes he wants to get to a different system, finds that RDP is active on that other system, and connects to that system. And you can see the T number there for this technique is T1076. And also what's cool is that the sources from which this information it was derived are listed at the bottom of the page. So for example, there's a link to the APT1 report from Mandiant from 2013 where Mandiant talked about APT1 using RDP for a lateral movement. So you can get a sense of, well, which different groups that are being tracked use these techniques. So that gives you a little bit of an idea of what MITRE is, what MITRE ATT&CK looks like, what the information within looks like. What we tried to do here at Corelight is to look at the elements of, or just a subset. I mean, this webinar could be a class. I mean, there's so much here. We just wanted to provide an example or several examples of MITRE ATT&CK elements that have network relevance, and then show you how Zeek could be used to identify that activity. But at the end of the day, you got to remember, MITRE is trying to describe adversary activity. And what we're going to do is show you how that adversary activity fits within a network context, and then give you ways to interact with data that could be produced by Zeek. And you'll see as James goes through his examples, there's many levels to this. One level is you just have Zeek collecting logs in a text format or perhaps in a JSON format, and you're going through them by hand, or perhaps using JQ to render the JSON properly or something like that. Maybe at another level, you have some additional scripts built into Zeek so that it's doing something more interesting, and James will have a couple examples of that. Maybe another level beyond that is you have all of this data going into Splunk or Humio or some other type of log aggregation system, an elk stack or something like that. And then you're performing queries against that data. And you could query just at the very simplest level of, I want to see anything that mentions this element. Or you could be very complicated, like I want to see these elements when they hit this threshold of this over this period of time. And James will have some examples of that as well. So if you're new to this field, this could seem very overwhelming. So what we're trying to do is just give you some examples of the way that our data can be used to better understand adversary activity and to use the language of MITRE ATT&CK to describe it. And with that, James, could we have the next slide? And James is going to start showing you some examples of the TTPs extracted from ATT&CK and how Zeek and Corelight can work with a few of them.
Awesome. Thanks, Richard. I'll just give a brief kind of level set introduction to Zeek in case anybody on the call is not familiar with it, or maybe you've used it and tried it, but aren't quite aware of all of its feature set. So Zeek is an open source network security monitoring tool. It's been around quite a while. The first lines of code were written in 1995 by a gentleman named Vern Paxson at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, pictured there at the left. It's now got a healthy open source community of contributing developers, and it's certainly grown since those first few lines of code. But Vern is very much involved in the project today, and it used to be known as Bro. You might actually know it by that name. Up until last October, it was known as the Bro Network Security Monitor, but the open source committee decided it was time for a rename, and so it is now Zeek. And it's used today by thousands of organizations globally. Some of the biggest brands in the world with the top security teams right now are using Zeek in their environment to monitor network traffic and generate network insight. It's an out-of-band solution. So Zeek, the software you need to install on your own custom hardware, but it operates out of band. So it's being fed by a tap or a span port, something like that. It's not an inline solution like a firewall. I like when people ask what Zeek is, I like to break it down into kind of its three core functionalities, which you're seeing there on the right. So Zeek at its heart does three things exceptionally well. It transforms your raw traffic into rich, comprehensive interlink logs built for speed. So it's meant to be very quickly pivoted across. So security incident responders or threat hunters can very quickly move through the data because speed is of the essence when you're dealing with someone who's moving in real time across your network. Two, Zeek also is a file extraction tool, so it can take your raw network traffic and extract and reassemble those files, whatever they may be, .exe, .pdf, it doesn't matter. Zeek is capable of extracting and reassembling those files and then pointing them to a file analysis tool like FireEye, for example, or a repository for later forensic analysis, up to you. but Zeek also does file extraction exceptionally well. And lastly, kind of one of the really key functionalities of Zeek is that it's its own programming language, which Richard mentioned. You can actually script in the Zeek scripting language, sort of whatever your heart desires and can imagine in terms of network traffic analysis. So if you have an idea, such as, hey, ransomware is an issue that I'm concerned about. I have some ideas about how it could be detected via network analysis. You can actually write that script. And in fact, someone has done that, and they're basically looking at measures of file entropy as they cross the network and looking for evidence of increasing entropy, which would be evidence of encryption and possible an indicator that ransomware software is in the environment encrypting files. So that last functionality is really powerful. And I think kind of underutilized a lot in the community. A lot of people get exposed to Zeek through something like Security Onion and really only play around with the logs, which you're about to see in great depth. But Zeek really has these three really powerful legs of the stool, if you will. From a data source perspective, there's many different ways to generate insight about your network. There's no silver bullet here, but Zeek really is a head and shoulders kind of standalone data class when it comes to network data. That table you see there at the bottom, those letter grades are grades where someone has gone and measured and assigned a grade value to different types of network data sources based on kind of categories important to security operators. That gentleman is Chris Sanders. He's the founder of Applied Network Defense. You can see his website there, investigationtheory.com. He runs a number of great classes in the security space. He also trains and sets up SOC teams, so great resource. But Chris, as part of his course material, went ahead and looked at a number of different network data sources. We're just excerpting 3 here. On the left, you see Netflow, Zeek, and PCAP, and he graded them. And what you can kind of take away from this table here is that Zeek is almost a straight A student, with the exception of acquisition, which means your ability to actually acquire the data. The open source, as any open source tool, can sometimes be quite tricky to set up and scale in large environments. And so it's not quite an A student there in acquisition. That's actually where Corelight can come in, and we'll talk about that later. We can make acquisition dead simple for you. But across the board, from context to pivotability to data retention, Zeek is this A student where something like Netflow, really fast and cheap to store and search, but from a context perspective and a pivotability perspective, very limited. It's really only providing you that high-level connectivity information about who's talking to who. PCAP on the other side, right? A+ student when it comes to context, it's literally all the data. However, searchability, acquisition, and retention, you're not scoring well there because it's such a voluminous amount of data. It's not efficient to search fast, right? You're in Wireshark, you're spending hours digging through packets trying to find that kernel of truth in there. And you can't really store it for much longer than 60 to 90 days rolling at even peak budgets. We haven't really seen organizations out there doing it much more than that. So Zeek is kind of the Goldilocks data, if you will, that sits right in the middle there. Next slide, please, James. I mentioned the rich logging capability. We're about to really deep dive into some of these logs with the examples James is about to present, but just at a high level kind of overview here. These are examples of Zeek logs. Zeek generates over 50 different logs, analyzes 35+ different network protocols. So Zeek is a connection-oriented language. The logs that get generated are specific to network protocols. So what you're seeing here is kind of on the left, the connection log, which is the master kind of Netflow-like log, or Netflow on steroids, where you're getting all of this rich information about the connections happening at the highest level. But then you see there's an HTTP log, DHCP, a files log, SMTP. Really any major protocol that you can imagine has already a Zeek log being generated for it. And the thing that makes Zeek so powerful and differentiated is these logs are interlinked. So there are fields generated in each of these logs, including the UID, which is a unique connection identifier that gets generated, that allows you as a security operator to very quickly tell the story chronologically of what's happening in your environment by pivoting from one log to the next to the next. So you can see, the website visit gets an HTTP log generation. You can see that a file was downloaded from that website visit. You can look at that file. You can see the hash of that file. You can click on that hash and suddenly pivot and see every other instance where that hash crossed your network. It's a lightning fast way to make sense of what's happening on your network. Next slide, please, James. And I think James is about to get started and deep dive on some of these logs and how you can map them back to MITRE TTPs.
Yes, good morning. Thank you, Richard. Thank you, John. What I'm going to talk to today is I want to talk about the first set of techniques in the category of exfiltration tactics. And as was mentioned earlier, Zeek sensors are enterprise-grade solutions. And what you see on the right are the two highlighted techniques that we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss data transfer size limits and scheduled transfer, within the exfiltration category. So when we look at this in the MITRE framework, we've discovered that people really want to know about exfiltration. Can we catch data as it's being staged, before it exits my network? So MITRE looks at this and defines it as you see on the screen: transfers performed only at certain times of day or at certain intervals. And if I were to take an example, it's easy to tell these frigate birds apart by their distinguishing traits. But if we put any type of periodic entropy, that's going to significantly change the game. And if we were to look and say, looking at the graphic on the right from the left, when you have a degree of entropy, and all networks have some degree of entropy, that really makes it non-trivial to detect. So before I talk about how the detection occurs, really I want to talk about sharing scripts within the community. As we've mentioned earlier, Corelight runs Zeek, and it's a Turing-complete scripting language that allows you to generate new logs. You can write specific protocol parsers, or you can extend or modify existing logs with your scripts. These scripts can be used to automate analysis, whether it's compliance or targeted detection. But really what we want to talk about here is simplicity in sharing. And it's really with a package manager. So then you can get all of the package for your script, and you can easily share that to someone within your organization, a larger community, or even to a disparate organization altogether. Today, the first script we're going to really talk about is one that was created in 2014 by Reservoir Labs. You'd think that if it was created now 5 years ago, that it would really be an old hat. But there was tremendous valuable information there. And it was used in a 2017 Black Hat presentation by David Bianco and Robert Lee in their Go to Hunt Then Sleep. When they talked about this, they really talked about the producer-consumer ratio. So as you can see in the graphic, it allows you to measure, take shape of a system's network use. Because determining if someone is exfiltrating data can be very difficult, you can have something like this where the script is written so that you can see if you see large amounts of data, staging. Do you see a significant change in the producer-consumer ratio from one or more hosts? Even with this capability, scheduled transfers really are not trivial to detect. So let's talk about what can we do. Traditionally, everyone wants to start with the connections log. And this is something that John mentioned, where this is all of the communications between two IP addresses. So if we were to look at an analogy of the con log, I pulled up a Splunk query where we're looking at DNS. And in this case, we're looking at a time chart spanning at 3 hours, and we want to count them by queries. So if you're familiar with music, this would look like several musical forms. We have an A form here. We have a similar number of queries over the same time period. Then we have a B musical form where you see some changes, and then C, again, a different change. Now, of course, it would be simple to detect if this was the only thing you had on your network and you didn't have a high volume of traffic. But that's really where the challenge comes in. There's always some degree of entropy within your network. So what can we do? How can we help with this? So what we see start are some relevant Zeek logs that can assist, because not everything is going to be so straightforward. We've already discussed the connections log, but if we look at what if it's encrypted? So Zeek generates an X509 log, and this is where you have all of the certificate details. So maybe there's an indicator there for this subject alt name. Maybe it's in the certificate issuer. There are several fields that can be pivoted that can be used as indicators related to the certificate. It's possible if it's an encrypted session, maybe none of the certificate details jumped out, but maybe there's something in the actual SSL or TLS handshake. Maybe it's a specific cipher or curve that's used, or it's a server name. What Zeek is doing is it's taking all that information and making it available to assist in discovery. One that could be a little bit more of a long shot in assisting this is a files log. So in this case, if your Corelight sensor is performing file extraction, it's going to generate a hash of all the files that are extracted. And that can be either an MD5, a SHA-1, or a SHA-256. So that's something that can really alert if you see hashes that are known crossing your network. Now, one important piece of this is, it really is a discussion. During one particular hunt or compromise, Zeek was inserted in the network to monitor data. They were very confident that there was a breach. And what they did is they were looking with dashboards. Now, again, these are going to vary in your environment, but in this case, they were looking at DNS and SMB, or server message block dashboards. And as they started to filter out chatter from what they considered normal, they were able to discover C2 activity taking place. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through some of the slides. So another topic is data transfer size limits. So thinking back to 2010, there was a case of data exfiltration or theft with, think of Chelsea Manning. So when this act was committed, files had to be downloaded and extracted. Was there a spike in the transfer, or was it something where they stayed very low and slow, make it difficult to detect? Another simple graphic is, if you see a big cat, it's very easy to understand. If I had large data transfers coming down and I haven't seen those before, I recognize that something's happening and needs to be investigated. But the flip side is, a domestic cat, something that's small, is that still a threat? We believe it is, and we believe there are some tools that can assist in detecting this, as part of Zeek. The first valuable log is the long connections log. It was created it's a script written by Corelight. Now with this, it's going to look and see if something is non-closed or timed out, and then maybe it spans hours, days, or weeks. So there's going to be valuable information that's provided. What you see here is an example of the raw log format. Now there's a lot of content. I really only want to focus on a couple of items. You see in the upper left the path, so we're showing that it's the long connection. John mentioned earlier, he talked about the unique identifier. So in this, you see that unique identifier field. That's something that allows analysts the capability to pivot and look for other related sessions. Maybe there are other communications that took place. So we can go and find, was it an HTTP transaction? Was it an SSL transaction? What actually occurred? I personally am a fan of the history field. So each one of those letters has specific meaning. Those are the TCP control flags. So you can look and see, was there which of the originator or the responder initiated data transfer? How did my connection end? Was it a healthy transaction? And really with that on the far left, you see connection state. So connection state summarizes the connection. So it can be if it's rejected, a connection was attempted but rejected, could be indicative of something, or connection was established but the originator aborted it. It's really something that's quick and easy so that you can look to see what is that item that's out of the ordinary. And the last parent is tunnel parents. So if this connection was over a tunnel, there would be a value there, a unique identifier, to really list any encapsulating connections. So think of if it's a GRE tunnel or a Teredo, these are unencrypted tunnels. Maybe you have traffic IPv4 tunneled over V6. It's going to allow you as an analyst or an incident responder to be able to pull that thread to understand what is actually happening in this connection.
Hey, James, if I could just jump in there for a second. So just wanted to step back a little bit about data transfer size limits, so where this might have come from. Early on in the various APT actor movements through the network, many times incident responders would see the actors removing data in chunks of 650 megabytes or 700 megabytes. And the theory was that they were following their own TTPs that said, when we exfiltrate data, we burn them to CDs. And we either use the CDs for storage, or maybe we use them to transfer to other units or to consumers or whatever the case may be. So the hypothesis behind this activity is that well, there's two ways to approach it. One way is you've already seen through some other method that intruders are copying data out of your network in chunks. Maybe you had a compromised endpoint and you were able to see command line activity. Maybe you found commands running in memory. Maybe you heard from someone that this is something that they do. So the hypothesis is that if I look for activity of certain size and it occurs regularly, in other words, you generally wouldn't just steal one chunk of 650 or 700 megabytes and then do nothing more. If I see several of these chained, temporarily close to each other, then maybe I have some type of adversary activity going on. And this is a way that we could use Zeek to look for that activity, and how the log would manifest is what you see here. So that's kind of the process we're using with a lot of these, is making a hypothesis about what adversary activity might look like in your environment, coming up with some Zeek log sources that might show that, and then taking a look at what some of those logs might look like. Now, this doesn't mean we'll be able to say definitively whether the hypothesis has been disproven or there's still a possibility that it's true. You may need other forms of data, right? You may have to go to the endpoint and take a look at what's happening there. You may need PCAP, right? You may need to say, okay, well, if I can grab one of these 650 megabyte transfers, and it's either plain text or perhaps it's encrypted, but I have the encryption key off of an endpoint from memory or some other format, then I can decrypt it and see what's involved here. All right, thanks, James.
Excellent. No, excellent. I would say, and that really ties in nicely. So if we were to look at this and say, how do you find the sums of total data transferred? In this case, we're showing the query is written in Splunk, where what is organizing by source and destination and reverse that order of megabytes, how much has been transferred? That makes it rather simple to try and detect if you see large volumes of data being transferred. Or maybe you want to set thresholds. If I see more than X% of traffic going between hosts. And so in this case, you can see it was written to see more than 40% of traffic. It's really dependent on your environment. What are the thresholds? What is some degree of normal in your environment where something will stick out to be something of interest? Continuing on this thread, Helminth was mentioned on the attack site, related to exfiltration. I thought it would be good to just briefly talk about this. So there are great write-ups by Unit 42 from Palo Alto and FireEye's team. You can see there's a link at the bottom to the FireEye blog. In this case, in the first stage, content is downloaded. We have a host, a URI, and a method, really, that's defined in those two bullets. And that's great data. Those can be great indicators. The HTTP log that you see on the right captures all of that data. So it captures that and records that. So it's something that you can look for, you can query for, whether you are looking for a flat file, maybe you're awk, grepping or bro cutting through something, or you can put it in your analytics platform. Again, Databricks, Elastic, or Splunk looking through. So in this case, we can go through and maybe see the first stage, but what if you missed the first stage? And you see in this one instance, it can use PowerShell to exfiltrate data via DNS. Well, there's a very powerful DNS log. So in this case, some of the steps it finds is it queries a C2 server. When it goes to that query, there's a query field in the DNS log. So we will record that query going out. There's a specific reply coming back with an identified pattern. There's an answer coming back. In addition, there are fields that define the query type and the response code. So what we're doing is we're making all of that information available for you to detect. Again, and also as subdomains are generated, because there's an answer field, you will see if something is a domain generated algorithm, for instance. Looking through, in this case, I thought it would be good to tell a quick story. In this case, it's using iodine, because that's one of the data sets that I was looking through, but it applies to really some of the Helminth principles we just talked about. In this case, again, looking through a Splunk interface, doing a search, looking through the DNS log, and looking for something where your query length is longer than 25 characters. 25 characters is not the magic number. That just was what was selected in this query. And if you look and see, there were several longer queries going through from many different hosts, and the counts look normal, except you see I have 10,424 from this particular host. Well, if we pivot on this unique identifier, let's see what we can discover. We change pivot on that. Now let's see, what do we see with our queries? I see queries that it's highly suspect that someone is going to type in a query that's that long and that random. But if we look through, we see several of them that end in sweetcoldwater.com. We see 11,400 entries going from this host related as part of this unique identifier for this session. That tells me that there's something suspect here. If I again take that DNS query, and now I'm looking for subdomains of Sweet Cold Water, and I'm showing that how many times, what do I see? You'll see I have all of these long, following a DGA generating as part of Sweet Cold Water, and I have 11,408 events. There's a high degree of confidence that you shouldn't visit the same site or try and have that type of site. So again, we're showing what are the ways that you can kind of catch this exfiltration using Zeek and a Corelight sensor. Let's transition and talk about command and control, because while exfiltration is very important because people would like to catch data that's being staged prior to being exfilled, what about command and control? So the command and control list you can see is very long. As Richard mentioned earlier, there are two that we're going to talk about: the commonly used port and connection proxy. The principles that we're going to talk about for the data can apply to several other of the techniques that are mentioned here. If you look at the bottom, the uncommonly used port or port knocking, we're not going to go into those techniques, but if you think back a few slides, we talked about the history field and we list the TCP control flags for catching those. That's something that could be very important to see if someone is attempting port knocking. So the first one we'll talk about today is commonly used port. Again, as MITRE defines this, adversaries communicate over a common port to bypass, network detection systems and to blend in. Because the challenge you have is there can be, hundreds of thousands of connections coming across HTTP, or SSL. How are you going to provide analysis to determine, this one connection? Is that really a sheep, or is it something else more nefarious? The way that Zeek and Corelight address this is through dynamic protocol detection. And so a way when we talk about this is, before we talk about the actual dynamic protocol detection, let's look at a query again. Again, this could be in any analytics platform. And what you see in red, in the first query is we're looking at our connection. Our connections log show communications between two IP addresses. And show me a search if I see the service of HTTP and not port 80, or I see port 80 and not HTTP. Now you can change those. Think of TLS and 443, 8080 and HTTP. There are lots of variants that you can do, but what this is doing is it's giving you something to look at to see if you see traffic that's out of the ordinary within your network environment. Additionally, because the Zeek Network Security Monitor parses protocols, in the connections log, if you see a service defined as unknown, that could be highly suspect. You shouldn't see something in your network environment that is unknown. So what we see here, this is the dynamic protocol detection log. So again, you can see it's pretty succinct in what it has. And we're going to focus on just a couple of those fields. So again, this is in the raw format. We see our unique identifier. So we can look and see within this, are there other connections that are related to this, other sessions? Specifically in this case, we see that it was the analyzer that was used was the SSL analyzer. And why did it fail? It failed because it had an invalid version late in the TLS connection. So it didn't follow the RFC. So in this case, the attacker was attempting to hide a backdoor by disguising their communications so components, think of an IDS, would see it and ignore it, because it would make the assumption that subsequent traffic after the SSL handshake was unreadable. But in reality, this is a sample capture from two attacker-controlled machines where they're communicating with each other using their own custom protocol. It's designed to look like SSL or TLS, but it's not. So when Corelight sees this type of behavior and doesn't follow the RFC, it can quickly, raise this to your analyst, to your SOC's attention. And you can do this at scale.
This reminds me just of the power of Zeek and the fact that it's not doing a byte string match in order to find something suspicious. It understands the protocols it sees. When it sees something that deviates, it lets you know. And that doesn't necessarily guarantee that there's a problem there, but it gives you a place to start looking. And unless the intruder has done a very good job of making sure that the protocol that he or she's written is not going to trip this sort of thing, you may find their activity when they didn't intend for you to find it.
Absolutely. So let's look at another, one of the techniques, a connection proxy. So there's no secret sauce in this. It's really to see if there's a proxy that's been set up, for network communications. As we've talked about earlier, the HTTP log contains a summary of all the requests and responses, and the HTTP log is even extensible. So you can add things. For instance, with Chrome, sometimes there's origin header from Chrome plugins. So you can extend this through the scripting language. But in this case, we're interested in detecting proxies. There's a great write-up on the Zeek.org site talking about monitoring HTTP and specifically with related to proxies. But I wanted to show another query. So again, in this case, we're looking at our HTTP log, and we're looking in the field proxied to see if there's any value. And what I want to do is then I want to count and see how many times have I seen this. So again, in your environment, maybe you have a few proxies running. So this will allow you to verify the number that you see if you have a network documentation that's actually matching what you see on the wire. Or maybe you should have none. So again, these are simple queries that are available because of the way that Zeek parses network traffic and what is stored. Moving on to the last section, this is personally my favorite. We're going to talk about tactics related to lateral movement. Now, lateral movement, think of the east-west monitoring. This is really, interesting for the creativity that adversaries can show, because their goal is to look like traditional administrative traffic, because they know administrators are operating on the network. If it's difficult for a defender to discern, an attacker, someone who's actually abusing some administrative tool from, actual abuse. We're going to talk about the distributed common object model and SSH hijacking. First, we see a mouthful of words in the definition of the lateral movement component object model. So in this case, it's specifically discussing the distributed, the DCOM. So it's what allows a local computer, you can really extend functionality beyond a local computer using RPCs, or remote procedure calls. It's a component of the Windows API and enables application between software objects. So what exactly does that mean? In this case, Zeek provides visibility through the DCE RPC log. So as you see on the right, the log doesn't have, it's very succinct in its presentation. There are things particularly interesting: name pipes, endpoints, and operations. And I think it's important to note that there's been discussion, in some sites about extending this to have specific, possibly parsing class identifiers. The beauty of Zeek is it allows extensibility. If someone has something to offer and share where they want to expand the capabilities, it can be done, and they can add that to the log. There's something that's really extraordinary that someone detects or they think is an indicator that is otherwise invisible. So there is it's there's not a lot of data out there that's really easy to read. If you're into reverse engineering or you're into malware analysis, specifically related to Microsoft, there are resources on the Microsoft site, but it's traditionally very old. The published books about this topic are older. But really what I'm going to talk about is the adversaries want to blend the endpoint and the operations number, the operations. Those are really identifiers. And they're identifiers for processes that are allowing remote communication. So what can we do? Really a great example to this, I think, is scheduled tasks. So if you were to look through and see, this is a pretty lazy search because just searching for the iTask scheduler service without defining the field. But in this case, the endpoint for scheduled tasks, for remote tasks, is labeled the iTask scheduler service. In this instance, we're executing a query and we're organizing the results by the unique identifier. So in this case, again, we see there are 5 unique identifiers there. And each one of those identifiers is a session. So there's a set of traffic related to that. So now that we have scheduled tasks identified on our network, which very well may be legitimate, we can pivot in and look to see what we can find. So if we take that search, and now we're going to search on the unique identifier. So that's from one of the fields that we just defined where we saw the iTask scheduler running. What do we see? So we see several different logs that are related to that. So we see our connection log. Again, those are their 2 IP addresses communicating to each other. We see NTLM. There's some NT or Windows specific credentials being exchanged. And then there's the operation that's being performed, using DCOM. So if we were to go through and look at this and we zero in on one of the logs, if we start off with our connection, we see first that this is an IP version 6 connection. We see as one of the scripts that Corelight offers is hostname resolution. So as a Corelight sensor sits and deployed, it's going to learn of name resolution that takes place. So in this case, you see in the third box down, there's the host name value and how it was learned. So in this case, it was learned from a DNSA record. We saw several services at the very bottom of the screen be applied during this connection. But now if we take and let's pivot and let's look at the NTLM log. What important information can we glean from that? Well, we see the host name of the workstation. We see the username. So in this case, it was the administrator was logging in. So now we see the workstations that were communicating from our connections log. We see the user that was used. So should we see that user communicating from those workstations? Maybe we shouldn't see IPv6, for example, communicating with this. Or maybe exclusively IPv6. It's really dependent on your network. Again, going back to that point that Richard made, is there's no silver bullet. It's about the data that is made available to you from Zeek is really what allows you, as an analyst to detect abuse or some of the techniques that the adversary will use from the MITRE framework. The last piece of this is if we look at the operation. So again, now what we see is that there was a negotiation of the RPC at the bottom. We see there was an enumeration of tasks to learn what tasks were there, and then a task was scheduled. So again, we're able to look at all of these logs because they were linked together by that unique identifier that Zeek applies, so that an analyst can understand what happened in a connection. They can determine is this an abuse or is this legitimate. The last topic today is SSH hijacking. So this is also lateral movement, and really in this, it's an exploitation of trust relationships. And really, the value here of Zeek lies in relationships and pivoting. We've talked about the connections log. We've talked about the long connections, but there's also an SSH log. So in SSH, we're going to extract information, about that connection. What's the SSH client communicating to which SSH server? Those are strings, in addition to the ciphers that are used and the key exchange. So all of that is readily available. That can assist as we look to detect hijacking. There's also a software log that Zeek collects. So in this case, it's looking to see as traffic is being parsed and that information is being recorded, it is looking to see software types, major versions, minor versions, so that you can present and see, if you see something new in your environment. So I thought that was relevant to mention here. The last piece of this as we go through is we'll talk about a script that was written by the team at Salesforce that allows for fingerprinting of SSH connections. So it can really assist in reducing data volume to see if you can detect hijacking taking place. So again, thinking back when we originally started the presentation, we talked about it. If all you have is the connections log. It's really showing two IP addresses communicating to each other. In this case, we're looking for in the connections log where a service is defined as SSH. So Zeek has identified this as an SSH protocol. What can we find? If you were to look at this, it would be difficult to have something jump out at you to say that this is interesting or this could be indicative of hijacking. But let's use some of the other logs. If we take and we pivot and we now look at the long connections for SSH, now we see something that could be interesting. So in our responding host, we see a 192.68.0 that ended with a reset by the originator, and the originating host is not in the other subnets. So that could be something that's interesting. If we also look down at the prior screen, back down to our connection log, we see that same host communicating to another IP address that really falls outside of the other subnets that we have. So again, part of it's going to depend upon understanding your environment, defining local networks, and then using all of the logs that are available. The last piece is looking at the actual SSH log. And in this case, we're just looking to see what clients do we see here. Maybe we expect to see, WinSCP, PuTTY, OpenSSH, but maybe we shouldn't see, Cisco coming through. And what in the wide world of sports is that? So again, it's that item, it's that, to me, it's about having great data. Better data enables better hunting to find that interesting topic so that you can really drill down to see, is this something that is really out of the ordinary? Have I discovered something in my network environment?
I think that's key, James. So when you have this data, you can do things with it that will probably surprise you. And it's not like you have to install an agent on every system. You don't have to stand up this huge, 24U rack of equipment, because the data is so rich yet so compact. You can collect a lot of it and just out of the box get so much of this utility. And if you find that in the course of doing your work that you'd like to extend it, then there are scripts you can either write yourself or you can add. And if you want to go even farther and augment the way the software itself works, that's a possibility. And that's why I'm such a fan of this approach.
Absolutely. And I think that's again, a great transition. I mentioned earlier, Hash was written by the team at Salesforce. This is kind of a follow-on to their JA3 and the JA3S that they developed. So if you're not familiar, that would be worthwhile to look up for as far as TLS fingerprinting. But in this case, they're extending the SSH log. So remember we thought about the log before, it was capturing the ciphers that were used, the client, the server that was communicating, the unique identifier. So it captured, really the important points, but they wanted to look at it and say, let's extend this so that we can see, we can possibly detect something if it's a known exploit kit. Maybe someone else has seen this, to see what we can do. So here again is an example of an SSH log. What you see in red are the extensions that they add. So in this case, they are recording the algorithms because maybe, you have taken the time to remove other algorithms that are known to be weaker. Maybe that, again, that's the adversary trying to blend in. They've added other things. So we're presenting and making that data available to you. We also have, looking at that SSH log, the ability to dedupe that I mentioned earlier. So in this case, what was, it was only 203 events, so it's not a huge unmanageable number, but we went from that 203 deduping by using the hash server value that they come up with, and we went down to 3. So immediately we went from a very large number of potentially interesting items, dropping it all the way down to a very manageable number for an analyst to be able to investigate. This is really why I think this information is great and why I think the most advanced SOCs and analysts love Zeek data. It's the flexibility, that it provides. I hope you found this information very useful, and I'll turn this back over to you, John.
Great. Thanks so much, James and Richard. Just a quick kind of 30 seconds about us, Corelight. So who are we? We are a commercial grade Zeek solution. We make Zeek easy and enterprise grade to deploy. If you're familiar with the open source software, that can be tricky to get up and running. You're not going to have to spend months setting it up in your environment. It's really a 15-minute deployment with Corelight. You just plug it in, make a few configuration settings, and you're off and running, getting to take advantage of the great data that you saw in this presentation. It also comes with a whole suite of manageability features and enterprise functions like direct integration with your favorite security tools like Splunk, where in the open source world, you're going to be spending a lot of time manually configuring those data exports and mapping fields to Splunk, et cetera. So, in a nutshell, who are we? We make Zeek easy and enterprise grade to deploy. If you can go to the next slide, James. We have a range of sensors to meet your needs depending on your environment. So we have 3 appliance-based sensors sized by throughput speed, 2 gigabit, 10 gigabit, and 25 gigabit sensor. If you're familiar with open source Zeek, that high-end sensor, the 25 gig sensor is up to a 10x performance improvement over what you're going to be able to achieve in the open source world. We also have a virtual form factor. We support the VMware platform. We have 4 reference configurations there if you want to deploy in VMware as well. We have a few minutes left for question and answer and a couple questions that came through. So James, if you wouldn't mind just skipping to the last slide with your guys' contact information, we will just jump right into Q&A. We've got a couple questions that have come in here. Got a question here. Have any of the speakers encountered methods for mapping attack TTPs against kill chain oriented tools like Lockheed Cyber Kill Chain?
Well, you could take, really what that involves is looking at the kill chain, which is fewer elements, and they're typically loaded before the activity of whatever the intruder is there to accomplish. So you just take those kill chain elements and you line them up with the columns that are in attack. That's all that's involved there. The kill chain was one of a series of ways of describing adversary activity, but it was more at that tactical level. It didn't get into the details quite so much, but necessarily that wasn't what it was about anyway. It was to get us thinking about the sorts of activities that intruders had to accomplish, and the idea that if you could interdict them at any one of those points, then you win and they lose. Or if the intruder made it all the way to the end and you didn't catch them, or you only caught them at certain points, you could see that they had to have accomplished those other tasks in order to accomplish their goal, and that would reveal detection or prevention gaps for you. Yeah, so that's all that's involved with that.
Great. I think we'll probably have time for about 2 more questions here. Let's see. Can the speakers name and describe some of their favorite Zeek scripts? So I think we mentioned JA3, long connection. Are there other scripts that you guys are particular fans of in the Zeek world?
I don't know, James, do you have any others?
I'm personally a fan of the SMB version 1. So while it shouldn't be on networks, it's something simple for compliance that can generate a notice if it's ever detected, NotPetya exploited SMB version 1. I think another is the integration with Team Cymru's malware hash registry. So we talked about the ability to extract or carve files off of the wire. So when Zeek carves a file off the wire, if you have the script running, it will automatically go check Team Cymru's site via the API and determine if that hash is on their site. Now, I think that's fantastic, but I would also say if you are a shop that has your own watch list, you could modify that script and point it to your own internal watch list. So I think it's both the power of Zeek and also the power of the community as far as scripting goes. Those are the 2 that come to mind for me.
Great. All right, and with that, we're at the last question here. James, I think this is for you. Can you speak more about finding related sessions with the DPD log?
That's really challenging, because what's going to happen is if you have a protocol that doesn't conform to the RFC and you see DPD being generated, that's really at a point where you want to target resources, I would say. And while we mentioned at the start of this presentation, network and endpoint don't live in isolation. So at that point, you might want to look specifically at endpoint capabilities that you have, or possibly PCAPs. While we believe network visibility is the first step you should have, in an instance like this, if it's a protocol that's unidentified, you really need to try and target PCAP to be able to capture that, so you can do analysis to see if it's something possibly, writing a new parser. Think about C2 protocols like Ghost, you know, an oldie but goodie. You know, the first time that was discovered, it was probably an unknown and triggered a DPD log. Richard, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think that's the key part to this. No one knows what the intruder is going to do in their environment. If they follow tactics or techniques that have been seen in other places, perhaps you can try to get ahead of them. But if you are a tier 1 target, intruders are going to do things that no one has even thought about. 0 days are obviously the most trite way to think about that, but there could be plenty of other ways that intruders act that you simply don't know what to look for. But if you are collecting high quality NSM data with Zeek and you are logging this stuff, once you know what to look for, you can go back and find it, and you can say, oh, that's when this problem began. There's been so many cases of different sorts of activity that have come along, and people, you know, the first question you want to know is, am I affected by this? And if you have the data, you can go back and look for it. If you don't have the data, you have to stand something up once you know that there's a problem, and then hope that, well, you know, you don't hope that the bad thing happens, but your only knowledge of whether it'll happen is if it happens from that point forward. By collecting this, really what is lightweight data, and ideally in many places as possible, not just at your egress point. You want to be collecting it north-south, but also east-west and at key locations and so forth. By collecting this data, you've got it there, so that when something happens, you can go look at that data first. You don't want to be looking at the endpoints because the intruder could be on the endpoint. You want to go look into your data store, see what you can find, and then use that as the decision point to either begin a different type of collection, do more collection, declare it closed, whatever the case may be.
Gentlemen, thank you so much. With that, we're at time. I want to thank everybody who tuned in today. And of course, our esteemed panelists, Richard and James, thank you guys so much for sharing your time with us today. I certainly learned a lot. We will be making a recording of this broadcast available. We'll be putting it up on Corelight's YouTube channel. And if you would like a copy of the presentation, we can share that in PDF form. Just reach out to us at webinars@corelight.com. And with that, we are going to close today's presentation. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you.